Mark's barbershop had been a staple in the small town of Riverview for decades, nestled on Main Street between a bakery and a second-hand bookstore. It wasn't a flashy place, its faded blue awning and hand-painted sign bore the marks of time, but it was home to countless stories shared over the years. Mark inherited the shop from his father, who believed in two things: good haircuts and good deeds. For Mark, both were equally important, though life hadn't made it easy for him to keep the latter a priority. On a brisk November morning, the shop was quieter than usual. Mark sat in his worn leather barber chair, flipping through the local newspaper, though his mind wasn't on the headlines. Business had been slow for months. The pandemic had hit the small town hard, leaving businesses shuttered and people struggling. Mark's savings were nearly depleted, and he had no idea how he'd pay the rent next month. As he stared at the article about a local charity struggling to raise funds, he felt a pang of guilt. His father had always found ways to give back, even during lean times. But Mark didn't have the luxury of generosity anymore, or so he thought. A sudden movement outside the window caught his attention. A man in tattered clothes shuffled down the sidewalk, his gaze fixed on the ground. His beard was wild and unkempt, his coat far too thin for the chilly weather. Mark had seen him before, wandering the streets, always alone. He didn't know the man's name or story, but something about him struck a chord. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact with everyone, or how he clutched a torn plastic bag as if it contained all he had in the world. Mark watched as the man paused in front of the bakery next door, peering through the window. After a moment, he sighed and kept walking. Mark's instinct was to look away, to pretend he hadn't noticed, but something his father used to say echoed in his mind: the smallest kindness can change the biggest problems. Before he could second-guess himself, Mark stood up, opened the door, and called out, "Hey, you! Wait up!" The man froze mid-step, clearly startled. He turned slowly, his wary eyes meeting Mark's for the first time. Up close, he looked even rougher, his cheeks were hollow, his hands red and cracked from the cold. "You look like you could use a haircut," Mark said, forcing a smile. "Come on in. It's on the house." The man hesitated, his body tense with mistrust. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. Mark shrugged. "Because you look like you need one. No strings attached." For a moment, it seemed like the man might refuse. Then, with a small nod, he stepped inside. The warmth of the shop enveloped him, and he visibly relaxed. Mark gestured to the chair, and the man sat down gingerly, as if afraid he might break something. "What's your name?" Mark asked as he draped the cape over him. "Jim," the man replied quietly. "Nice to meet you, Jim. I'm Mark. Let's see what we can do here." Mark studied Jim's matted hair and overgrown beard, deciding to start with the beard. As he worked, he kept the conversation light, asking Jim about the weather and his favorite food, trying to ease the tension. Jim answered in short, cautious sentences, but gradually, he began to open up. By the time Mark moved on to trimming Jim's hair, the man was sharing bits and pieces of his life. He had once been a mechanic, running a small garage in a neighboring town. But after a string of bad luck, a fire at the garage, a divorce, and mounting medical bills, he lost everything. He had been living on the streets for nearly 3 years. Mark listened without judgment, his hands steady as he worked. He didn't offer pity or advice, just a quiet presence that seemed to put Jim at ease. By the time he was done, Jim looked like a different person. His hair was neatly trimmed, his beard shaped and clean. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't even recognize myself," he murmured. Mark smiled. "Told you it was on the house." Jim stood up, his posture straighter than before. He thanked Mark repeatedly, his voice choked with emotion. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "Sometimes, you just do what feels right," Mark replied. As Jim left, Mark felt a strange sense of fulfillment, even as he wondered if he'd done enough. He didn't know if Jim had a place to sleep that night or where his next meal would come from. But at least, for a moment, he had given the man some dignity back. Later that evening, Mark decided to share the experience on social media. He wasn't looking for attention, he just wanted to remind people that small acts of kindness could make a difference. He posted a simple before and after photo of Jim with the caption, "A haircut may not solve everything, but it's a start." The post went viral overnight. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times, with comments pouring in from all over. People were inspired by Mark's gesture, some even offering to donate money or supplies to help others like Jim. Mark was overwhelmed by the response but had no idea how far-reaching it would be. That afternoon, as Mark was sweeping the shop floor, he heard the bell above the door jingle. He looked up and froze. Standing in the doorway was the mayor, accompanied by a camera crew and several reporters. Mark's heart raced as the mayor extended his hand. "Mark, your story has touched the entire town," the mayor said. "You've reminded us of the power of community. We want to do more to help people like Jim, and it starts here." Before Mark could respond, the cameras started rolling, and the mayor began speaking about a new initiative to support the homeless, inspired by Mark's act of kindness. Mark felt a mix of pride and disbelief as the shop filled with people, all wanting to know more about the man who had sparked this movement. But the real shock came when Jim walked back into the shop, clean-shaven and wearing a borrowed suit. He had been invited by the mayor to share his story, and as he spoke, the room fell silent. Jim's words were raw and powerful, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. For Mark, it was a moment of clarity. He had always believed in the value of kindness, but he never imagined it could ripple out so far. As he stood there, surrounded by his community, he realized his father had been right all along. The smallest kindness could change the biggest problems. And this was only the beginning. The morning after the mayor's visit, Mark woke up to a whirlwind he wasn't prepared for. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, the screen lighting up with messages, calls, and social media alerts. Overnight, his small act of kindness had transformed his little barbershop into the talk of the town, and beyond. Articles about the story had appeared in local newspapers, and a few regional news outlets had picked it up, describing the barber with a big heart, who was inspiring people to think differently about homelessness. Mark's first instinct was to feel overwhelmed. He wasn't the type to seek the spotlight, he was just a regular guy trying to do the right thing. But as he read through the messages pouring in, a different feeling began to emerge. There were people thanking him for reminding them of the power of humanity, others offering to donate supplies to help Jim, and even a handful of barbers from nearby towns asking if they could volunteer to give free haircuts, too. Mark realized he had accidentally started something bigger than himself. By the time Mark opened his shop that morning, there was already a line forming outside. It wasn't just his regular customers, there were strangers holding coffee cups, a few reporters with notebooks and cameras slung over their shoulders, and even a man holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Kindness is contagious." Mark hesitated for a moment, his hand on the door handle. He wasn't sure he was ready for this level of attention, but he also knew he couldn't turn back now. As soon as he unlocked the door, the crowd surged forward, filling the small shop with chatter and energy. A young journalist was the first to approach him, thrusting a microphone toward his face. "Mark, you've become a local hero overnight. How does it feel to be an inspiration to so many people?" Mark blinked, unsure how to answer. "I'm not a hero," he said after a moment. "I just gave a haircut. That's what I do." But the journalist pressed on, asking more questions about Jim, the mayor's visit, and the sudden viral fame. Mark tried his best to stay humble, deflecting the attention back to the real issues. "If this inspires people to help others, then I'm glad," he said. But there's so much more that needs to be done. Jim's just one guy, there are so many others out there who need help. As the day went on, the shop turned into a hub of activity. People dropped off food, blankets, and hygiene supplies for Jim and others in need. Local businesses reached out, offering their services to support Mark's newfound mission. A baker from next door brought over trays of pastries for anyone who stopped by, and a florist down the street donated fresh flowers to brighten up the shop. Jim himself returned later that afternoon, looking nervous but determined. He had spent the morning reconnecting with an old friend who had seen his transformation online and offered him a place to stay temporarily. Jim's eyes were brighter than they had been the day before, and he stood a little taller as he walked through the door. "I just came to say thank you again," Jim said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You didn't just give me a haircut. You gave me hope. I haven't felt that in a long time." Mark was about to respond when another man stepped into the shop. He was dressed sharply in a suit, his presence commanding attention. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. "Jim," the man said, his voice tinged with surprise and recognition. Jim froze, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. "Mike," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the mayor. But what nobody in the room knew, what even Mark hadn't realized, was that Jim and the mayor shared a past. Years ago, when Jim still had his garage, he had helped Mike get his old car running again for free when Mike was struggling to make ends meet as a young teacher. The two men had lost touch over the years, their lives taking very different paths. Now, they stood face to face, each changed in ways they couldn't have imagined. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men stared at each other. Finally, the mayor broke the silence. "You helped me when I needed it most," he said. "I never forgot that." Jim looked down at his hands, his voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone remembered me." "I do," the mayor said firmly. He turned to the crowd and began speaking, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "This is what community is about, helping each other, lifting each other up when times are tough. Jim was there for me once, and now it's my turn to be there for him." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in years, Jim smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. Inspired by the reunion between Jim and the mayor, the town rallied together in ways Mark had never seen before. A local nonprofit stepped in to coordinate donations. And a group of volunteers began organizing free services for the homeless, from haircuts to meals to job placement assistance. Mark's shop became the epicenter of the movement, a place where people gathered not just for haircuts but for hope. But as much as Mark was grateful for the positive changes, he couldn't ignore the challenges that came with his newfound role. The constant media attention was exhausting, and he found himself struggling to balance his regular business with the demands of the growing movement. He worried about whether he could keep up, whether he was really making a difference in the long run. One evening, after the shop had finally quieted down, Mark sat alone in the barber chair, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He felt a mix of pride and doubt, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Was he doing enough? Was this sustainable? What would his father have done in his place? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He turned to see Jim standing there, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Figured you could use a break," Jim said, stepping inside. Mark accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past few days hanging between them. Finally, Jim spoke. "You know, I used to think my life was over," he said quietly. "Losing everything, living on the streets, it felt like I didn't matter anymore. But you changed that. You showed me that even when everything feels lost, there's still a chance to start over." Mark looked at Jim, his heart swelling with emotion. "You've changed things too," he said. "Not just for yourself, but for this whole town. People are waking up, paying attention in a way they haven't before. That's because of you. Jim shook his head. It's because of you, Mark. You gave me a chance when no one else would. And now, it's my turn to give back. The two men sat there for a while longer, sharing stories and dreams for the future. By the time Jim left, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't in this alone. As the shop fell silent once again, Mark glanced at the photo of his father hanging on the wall. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. "I think I finally get it now." The next day, Mark woke up ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The world might not change overnight, but with a little kindness and a lot of heart, anything was possible. And this was just the beginning. The following day brought a crisp dawn over Riverview, its golden light spilling across the shop windows and highlighting the hustle and bustle that had begun to characterize Mark's barbershop. What was once a quiet, overlooked corner of Main Street had now become a hive of activity. Mark arrived early, as he always did, but even before he unlocked the door, he could see a few familiar faces waiting outside, bundled in coats and scarves to ward off the morning chill. Jim was among them, carrying a clipboard and a new sense of purpose. In the few days since his transformation and the mayor's visit, Jim had taken it upon himself to coordinate with the growing number of volunteers and donors who were eager to help. The same man who had once walked the streets of Riverview invisible to the world now seemed to have found his footing. He waved to Mark with a broad grin, his confidence infectious. Mark smiled back, unlocking the door and stepping inside. As Jim and a few volunteers followed, they began organizing the supplies that had poured in over the past days: bags of clothing, stacks of blankets, crates of canned goods, and boxes of hygiene kits. The shop, though small, had become a staging ground for the town's newfound spirit of giving. "Morning, Mark," Jim said, his voice full of energy. "We've got a busy day ahead. There's a group from the high school coming by to drop off more donations, and the local church is sending over volunteers to help pack care packages. Oh, and a reporter from the regional paper wants to do a follow-up story." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "You're really running the show now, huh?" Jim shrugged, but his smile widened. "I figure it's the least I can do after everything you've done for me. Plus, it feels good to have something to focus on." As the morning wore on, the shop filled with people, volunteers, donors, and even a few more individuals experiencing homelessness who had heard about what was happening. Mark found himself giving haircuts to a steady stream of clients, each one leaving the chair looking, and often feeling, like a new person. For some, it was the first time in years they'd been treated with dignity and care, and the gratitude in their eyes was enough to keep Mark going, even when exhaustion began to creep in. Around midday, the mayor arrived again, this time without the cameras or reporters. He pulled Mark aside, his expression serious but warm. "Mark, I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening here," he said. "You've started something incredible, but I know it's a lot to handle on your own. The town council is meeting next week, and I want to propose a partnership, a way to expand what you're doing here into a full-fledged community initiative. We could secure funding, find a larger space, and really make a difference." Mark was taken aback. The idea of expanding the effort was exciting, but it also felt overwhelming. He thought about the long hours he'd been putting in, the strain of balancing his business with the growing movement, and the responsibility of keeping it all going. "I appreciate that, Mayor," he said cautiously. "But I'm not sure I'm the right guy to lead something like that. I'm just a barber." The mayor placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're more than that, Mark. You've inspired an entire town to come together. That's no small thing. Think about it, okay?" Mark nodded, though uncertainty still gnawed at him. As the mayor left, he glanced around the shop, watching as volunteers packed care packages and Jim helped a young man pick out a warm jacket from the donations. Maybe the mayor was right, maybe this was bigger than him now. By late afternoon, the shop had quieted down again. Most of the volunteers had left for the day, and the supplies had been sorted and stored. Mark was sweeping up the floor when Jim approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Got you one," Jim said, handing him a cup. "Thanks," Mark said, taking a sip. "You've been working hard today." Jim shrugged. "Feels good to be useful again. You know, I was thinking about what the mayor said earlier." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You were listening?" Jim grinned. "I've got good ears. Anyway, he's right. What you've started here, it's special. But you don't have to do it all alone." Mark sighed, leaning against the counter. "I don't know, Jim. I'm just trying to keep my head above water here. Expanding this into something bigger, it feels like too much." Jim's expression softened. "You didn't think giving me a haircut would lead to all this, did you? Sometimes, things take on a life of their own. And when that happens, you just have to roll with it." Mark considered this, the weight of the past week settling on his shoulders. He thought about his father and the lessons he'd taught him about kindness and community. He thought about the people who had walked through his shop doors in recent days, people who had found hope, connection, and a sense of belonging. Maybe this was his chance to honor his father's legacy in a way he'd never imagined. That evening, as Mark closed up the shop, he found himself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. The little barbershop on Main Street had become something far greater than he'd ever anticipated. It was no longer just a place for haircuts, it was a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of small acts of kindness. As he locked the door and turned to leave, he saw Jim waiting outside, a quiet determination in his eyes. "Mark," Jim said, "whatever you decide, just know that you're not in this alone. We've got a whole town behind us now. And I'm here, too. You gave me a second chance, and I'm not about to waste it." Mark smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Thanks, Jim. That means a lot." Together, they walked down Main Street, the town lights casting a warm glow around them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Mark felt ready to face it, one step, one haircut, one act of kindness at a time. The next morning began with a peculiar quiet, the kind of stillness that hinted at something significant brewing just beneath the surface. Mark arrived at his shop early, the familiar creak of the old wooden door a small comfort in the chaos that had enveloped his life recently. Outside, the streets of Riverview were waking up, shopkeepers unlocking doors, early risers grabbing coffee from the bakery, and the occasional passerby pausing to glance at the now famous barbershop that had become the heart of the town's burgeoning movement. Mark had barely settled into his chair when Jim burst through the door, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He looked both exhilarated and nervous, clutching a folder under one arm and a takeaway coffee in the other. "Mark, you're not going to believe this," Jim said, his voice tinged with excitement. "We've got a meeting with the town council this afternoon. The mayor pulled some strings, and they want to hear about expanding the initiative." Mark blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, what? Today?" Jim nodded, setting the folder down on the counter. "Yeah, today. I know it's short notice, but this could be huge. They're talking about real funding, a dedicated space for the outreach program, and maybe even a partnership with local businesses." Mark felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. The idea of standing in front of the town council, pitching a program he'd never planned for, was daunting. But he also knew this was an opportunity they couldn't ignore. "All right," he said after a moment. "Let's do it. But you're coming with me." Jim grinned. "Wouldn't miss it." The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Customers trickled in for haircuts, but Mark's mind was elsewhere, running through potential talking points and worrying about the details. Jim, sensing his apprehension, took charge of organizing the growing pile of donations in the corner of the shop, occasionally offering reassuring comments about how they'd figure it out. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Mark and Jim were on their way to the town hall, the folder of hastily prepared notes tucked under Mark's arm. The council chambers were modest, with rows of wooden benches and a long table where the council members sat. The mayor greeted them at the door, offering a quick pep talk before ushering them inside. The room was filled with familiar faces, shop owners, local activists, and a few curious residents who had heard about the meeting. Mark's stomach churned as he stepped up to the podium, but he took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon, everyone," he started, his voice steady despite his nerves. "My name is Mark, and I run the barber shop on Main Street. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a free haircut to a man named Jim. What started as a small act of kindness has grown into something much bigger, something I never could have imagined." He paused, glancing at Jim, who gave him an encouraging nod. "We've seen this town come together in ways that are nothing short of extraordinary. People are donating their time, their resources, and their talents to help those in need. But the truth is, we've barely scratched the surface. There are so many more people out there who need help, and with the right support, we can do so much more." Mark outlined the vision for the expanded initiative, a permanent space where people experiencing homelessness could access not just haircuts but meals, clothing, and job training. He talked about the volunteers who had stepped forward, the donations that had poured in, and the partnerships they could build with local businesses and organizations. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Mark stepped back, his face flushed but relieved. Jim took the podium next, sharing his story with the kind of raw honesty that left the audience visibly moved. He spoke about the challenges of living on the streets, the stigma he faced, and the sense of hope he'd found through the simple act of kindness that had changed his life. By the time the council members began asking questions, it was clear they were on board. The mayor announced plans to allocate an unused building downtown as the new hub for the initiative, and several local business owners pledged their support on the spot. Mark and Jim left the meeting feeling a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. Back at the shop that evening, the two of them sat in the now empty space, reflecting on what had just happened. Mark stared at the notes in his folder, the magnitude of the day sinking in. "Did that really just happen?" he asked, half laughing. Jim grinned. "It did. And it's only the beginning." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The old community center downtown was cleaned and renovated by a team of volunteers, transforming into a welcoming space filled with donated furniture, shelves stocked with essentials, and a small kitchenette for preparing meals. Mark's shop continued to operate as usual, but he found himself spending more and more time at the new hub, juggling his role as a barber with his newfound responsibilities as an organizer. Jim, meanwhile, had become a leader in his own right. He coordinated volunteers, managed donations, and even started reaching out to other towns to share their story and gather additional support. For a man who had once been invisible, he was now a force to be reckoned with, his determination and charisma inspiring everyone around him. But the road wasn't without its challenges. Not everyone in town supported the initiative, and there were moments of pushback and skepticism. Some residents questioned whether the program would attract the wrong crowd, while others worried about the cost and logistics. Mark struggled with self-doubt, wondering if he was in over his head, if he was the right person to lead such a monumental effort. One evening, as Mark was closing up the shop, a woman walked in carrying a small bouquet of flowers. She introduced herself as Sarah, a single mother who had recently fallen on hard times. She'd heard about the initiative and wanted to thank Mark and Jim for what they were doing. "You gave me hope," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Knowing that there are people out there who care, it means everything." Her words stayed with Mark long after she left. He realized that even in the face of challenges, the work they were doing mattered. It was making a difference, not just for people like Sarah, but for the entire community. As the weeks went on, the initiative continued to grow. The new hub became a place where people could find not just resources but connection and support. Mark and Jim worked tirelessly, their bond strengthening with each passing day. They were no longer just a barber and a client, they were partners in a movement that was changing lives. One afternoon, as Mark walked through the bustling center, he overheard a young boy talking to his mother. "When I grow up," the boy said, "I want to be like Mr. Mark and Mr. Jim. I want to help people." Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. He thought about his father and the lessons he'd taught him, about the simple haircut that had started it all, and about the future they were building together. He realized that this was what his father had always meant when he said the smallest kindness could change the biggest problems. It wasn't just about haircuts or donations or even the center itself, it was about creating a ripple effect, inspiring others to see the humanity in one another and to act on it. And as Mark stood there, watching the community come together in ways he'd never dreamed possible, he knew they were just getting started. The transformation of Riverview's old community center into a thriving hub of hope was a testament to what could happen when people united behind a cause. It had been a few months since the town council approved the initiative, and Mark found himself standing in the middle of the bustling space one afternoon, marveling at how much had changed. The center was alive with activity, volunteers sorting donations, a group of teenagers tutoring children, and a retired chef teaching a small cooking class in the newly equipped kitchen. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, blending with the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting in from the kitchenette. Jim had become the face of the initiative, and deservedly so. He was everywhere, welcoming newcomers, organizing events, and speaking at gatherings to share his journey. What had started as a quiet effort to rebuild his own life had grown into something larger than either he or Mark had imagined. The townsfolk had come to see Jim not just as someone who had been helped, but as a leader and a symbol of resilience. That day, Jim was stationed at the front desk, greeting people as they came in. He had a clipboard in hand and a cheerful expression that radiated warmth. Mark approached him with a smile, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," Mark said, handing Jim a cup. "Thanks," Jim replied, taking a sip. "You're a lifesaver. It's been non-stop today." Mark leaned against the counter, surveying the activity around them. "I can't believe how much this place has grown. Remember when it was just a barbershop and a couple of boxes of donations?" Jim chuckled. "Feels like a lifetime ago. And to think it all started with a haircut." As they spoke, a young woman approached the counter, carrying a toddler on her hip. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her eyes were filled with gratitude. "Hi," she said softly. "I just wanted to thank you both. My little boy and I, we didn't have anywhere to go last month. But because of this place, we've got a roof over our heads and food on the table. I can't tell you how much it means to us." Jim's expression softened, and Mark felt a familiar pang of humility. "You don't have to thank us," Jim said gently. "We're just glad you're here." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "You've given us more than a place to stay. You've given us hope." As she walked away, Mark turned to Jim, his chest tightening with emotion. "Moments like that, they make all the sleepless nights worth it, don't they?" Jim nodded. "Yeah. They really do." But as much as the initiative had brought positive change to the community, it hadn't been without its challenges. Over the past few weeks, Mark had noticed an undercurrent of tension brewing. A handful of townspeople had begun to voice concerns about the center attracting outsiders and potentially increasing crime. Mark knew these fears were unfounded. There hadn't been a single incident since the center opened, but the negative sentiment was growing louder, fueled by rumors and misinformation. One evening, after closing up the barbershop, Mark sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, scrolling through comments on a local news article about the center. While most were supportive, a few stood out, their tone accusatory and divisive. "This is a great idea in theory, but who's paying for it? Taxpayers shouldn't be footing the bill for this kind of thing. Sure, they're helping people now, but what happens when word gets out and more homeless people start showing up? Our town isn't equipped for that. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. He hated seeing the community divided, especially over something that had brought so much good to so many. He knew he couldn't ignore the criticism, but he wasn't sure how to address it either. The next morning, he shared his concerns with Jim, who listened intently before offering a suggestion. "Why don't we hold an open house?" Jim said. "Invite everyone in town to come see what we're doing here. Let them meet the people we're helping, hear their stories. Maybe it'll change some minds." Mark considered this. It was a simple idea, but it had potential. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." Over the next 2 weeks, they planned the event, enlisting volunteers to help with everything from setting up tables to preparing food. They reached out to local businesses for support, and to their surprise, many were eager to contribute. The bakery donated pastries, the florist provided centerpieces, and even the hardware store offered folding chairs for the occasion. The day of the open house arrived, and the center was abuzz with activity. Mark and Jim greeted guests at the door, welcoming a steady stream of townsfolk curious to see what all the buzz was about. Inside, visitors wandered through the various rooms, chatting with volunteers and participants, watching presentations, and sampling the homemade treats laid out on tables. One of the highlights of the event was a series of short speeches from people whose lives had been touched by the initiative. Sarah, the single mother who had visited Mark's shop weeks earlier, stood up to share her story. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke about finding stability and a sense of belonging, her confidence grew. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. Jim spoke next, his words raw and heartfelt. He talked about his journey from rock bottom to where he was now, about the importance of kindness and community, and about the people who had helped him along the way. His speech left many in the audience wiping away tears. As the event wound down, Mark noticed a man lingering near the back of the room. He recognized him as one of the vocal critics from the online comments, a local business owner who had expressed concerns about the center. Mark approached him cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "Thanks for coming," Mark said, extending a hand. The man hesitated before shaking it. "I wasn't sure about this place," he admitted. "But seeing it in action, meeting the people here, it's changed my mind. What you're doing here is important. I see that now." Mark felt a wave of relief. "I'm glad you came. It means a lot." That night, as Mark and Jim cleaned up the center, they reflected on the success of the event. It hadn't erased all the skepticism, but it had made a difference. More importantly, it had reminded them, and the community, of the power of understanding and empathy. As they locked up for the night, Mark looked at Jim and smiled. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" Jim grinned. "Yeah, we are. And we're just getting started." The moon shone brightly overhead as they walked down the quiet streets of Riverview, their steps light with hope for what lay ahead. For all the challenges they'd faced, they knew the journey was far from over. But together, with the support of a community that was slowly but surely coming together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The weeks following the open house marked a turning point for Riverview. The event had not only quelled much of the skepticism but had also sparked a newfound wave of involvement. The community center, now affectionately called the Hope Hub, became a symbol of what Riverview could achieve when its people came together. Donations flowed steadily, volunteer numbers swelled, and partnerships with local businesses solidified into lasting relationships. Mark and Jim found themselves at the heart of a movement that was far bigger than either of them had anticipated. But with growth came new challenges. The increased attention brought more people seeking help, some from outside Riverview, and the small team of volunteers struggled to keep up with the demand. Mark often found himself working late into the night, balancing his responsibilities at the barbershop with the growing needs of the center. Jim, too, pushed himself to the limit, often skipping meals or sleep to ensure things ran smoothly. The weight of their responsibilities began to show in quiet moments when the two of them would sit in the now familiar office space they shared at the center, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. One particularly busy evening, as the last of the day's visitors trickled out, Mark found Jim sitting alone in the break room, his head resting in his hands. Mark grabbed 2 cups of coffee and joined him, sliding one across the table. "You look like you've been hit by a truck," Mark said, his tone light but concerned. Jim lifted his head and managed a weak smile. "Feels like it too. There's so much to do, Mark. Every time I think we're making progress, more people show up needing help. I'm starting to wonder if we're biting off more than we can chew." Mark sipped his coffee, nodding slowly. He felt the same way sometimes. The demands of running both the barbershop and the center had left him stretched thin, and he knew Jim was carrying even more. "I get it," he said. "It feels like we're climbing a mountain that keeps getting taller. But look at what we've already done, Jim. Look at the lives we've changed. That's not nothing." Jim sighed, his gaze distant. "It's just hard, you know. Seeing how much people are struggling. Knowing we can't fix everything." Mark reached across the table, placing a hand on Jim's shoulder. "We're not here to fix everything. We're here to do what we can. And what we've done so far, it matters." Jim nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Yeah. You're right. Thanks, Mark." The next day, a new opportunity presented itself. A regional nonprofit organization had taken notice of the center's work and reached out with an offer to partner with them. They proposed funding several new programs, including job training, mental health counseling, and temporary housing assistance. The catch? The partnership would require a formal structure, including a full-time staff and a board of directors. Mark and Jim met with the nonprofit's representatives at the center, going over the details of the proposal. It was an ambitious plan, one that could take their efforts to the next level, but it also meant relinquishing some control and transforming the grassroots operation into something more institutionalized. After the meeting, the two of them sat in their office, weighing the pros and cons. Mark stared at the stack of documents in front of him, his mind racing. "This could be huge," he said. "But it's a big change. Are we ready for that?" Jim leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "I don't know. Part of me thinks we need the support, they've got resources we could only dream of. But part of me worries about losing what makes this place special." They spent the next few days consulting with the volunteers, community members, and even some of the people they'd helped. The responses were mixed. Some were excited about the potential growth, while others shared Jim's concerns about losing the personal touch that had defined the center. One evening, as they closed up the center, Jim turned to Mark with a determined look. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "If we do this, we need to make sure it stays true to what we started. We need to set the tone, make sure the heart of this place doesn't get lost." Mark nodded. "Agreed. If we're going to take this step, we need to do it on our terms." They drafted a proposal outlining their conditions for the partnership. The center would remain community-focused, decisions would involve input from volunteers and participants, and they would maintain their mission of treating everyone with dignity and respect. To their surprise, the nonprofit agreed to their terms, impressed by their dedication and vision. The partnership brought immediate changes. The nonprofit provided funding for renovations, new programs, and paid staff, relieving some of the burden on the volunteers. A social worker and a job coach joined the team, offering services that had long been needed but impossible to provide before. The changes were met with a mix of excitement and adjustment, but over time, it became clear that the partnership was a turning point. For Jim, the shift was transformative. With the support of the nonprofit, he began leading workshops on resilience and storytelling, using his own experiences to inspire others. His sessions became a cornerstone of the center's offerings, drawing people from neighboring towns and even garnering attention from state-level organizations. Mark, meanwhile, found a renewed sense of purpose. While he continued to run the barbershop, he also took on a new role as an advocate, speaking at events and working with local leaders to address systemic issues contributing to homelessness and poverty. His quiet determination and grounded perspective made him a respected voice in the community. 1 year after the partnership began, the center hosted an anniversary celebration. The event drew a large crowd, including many of the people whose lives had been changed by the center. There were speeches, performances, and a slideshow showcasing the progress they'd made. Jim stood on the stage, addressing the audience with the same humility and passion that had defined his journey. "This place isn't just a building," he said. "It's a testament to what we can achieve, and we believe in each other. When we see the humanity in one another. None of us can do this alone, but together, we can move mountains." The crowd erupted into applause, and as Mark watched from the sidelines, he felt a deep sense of pride. He thought about his father and the values he'd passed down, about the small act of kindness that had started it all, and about the journey that had brought them here. As the celebration wound down, Mark and Jim found themselves standing outside, looking up at the stars. The center glowed warmly behind them, a beacon of hope in the quiet town. "Can you believe it?" Jim said, his voice tinged with wonder. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd even make it through the winter. And now, this." Mark smiled, his heart full. "It's amazing what can happen when you take a chance. On yourself, on others. On hope." Jim nodded, and for a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the journey settling over them like a gentle embrace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they knew they would face it together, bolstered by a community that had proven the power of compassion and the resilience of the human spirit. And as they walked back inside, ready to continue the work that had become their life's purpose, Mark couldn't help but think that his father would have been proud. The smallest kindness, he realized, truly could change the biggest problems. And this was just the beginning.